He left home to photograph a forgotten ghost town, expecting empty streets and silence, not an ending. 13 months later, they found him deep underground, preserved by salt, dressed like a clown, and posed as if death itself had been staged. What began as a simple disappearance turned into something far darker, a crime not meant to be hidden but displayed. Ethan Walker woke before his alarm that morning, stirred by a restless excitement he hadn't felt in weeks. The light creeping through the blinds of his childhood bedroom in Bozeman, Montana, carried the pale, washed-out color of late summer, the kind that made everything feel temporarily suspended between seasons. He lay still for a moment, listening to the quiet hum of the house and the distant sound of traffic beginning to build along the highway. Today wasn't just another drive with a camera slung over his shoulder. It was a place he had been thinking about for months, a location that had begun to feel less like a destination and more like an unanswered question. Alder Creek was the sort of place that rarely made it into guidebooks. Once a mining settlement tucked deep into the foothills, it had been abandoned decades earlier after toxic runoff poisoned the water and soil. What remained were skeletal houses half swallowed by weeds, warped porches leaning at unnatural angles, and rusted machinery frozen where workers had dropped it and never returned. To Ethan, that kind of stillness wasn't empty, it was loaded. He believed places like Alder Creek remembered things, that they held on to traces of the people who had lived and failed there. His photography professors called it environmental storytelling. Ethan thought of it more as listening. He dressed simply, pulling on jeans, a faded jacket, and boots scuffed from previous trips into rough terrain. Before leaving his room, he checked his camera bag for the third time. The film camera rested inside like a familiar weight, solid and reassuring. He preferred film for projects like this, despite the inconvenience. Digital felt too clean, too forgiving. Film demanded intention. Every frame mattered, every shot irreversible. His father teased him about it, saying Ethan chased ghosts with outdated tools, but his mother saw the seriousness behind it. She watched from the kitchen as he poured coffee into a travel mug, noticing the quiet focus in his expression. They talked briefly, nothing heavy. Ethan mentioned he'd be back before dinner, maybe earlier if the light didn't cooperate. He didn't say much about where he was going. Alder Creek sounded less ominous when he described it as an old site near Gallatin Canyon. His parents had learned not to worry too much about his trips. Photography had taken him to abandoned barns, burnout motels, and isolated stretches of desert before. This felt no different. He hugged his mother, waved at his father, and stepped outside into the cool morning air. The drive south was familiar, a stretch of road Ethan had traveled countless times. As Bozeman fell away behind him, the landscape opened up into wide fields and distant ridgelines that looked almost unreal in the early light. The sky was a soft, cloudless blue, promising clear conditions for shooting. He rolled the window down slightly, letting the smell of pine and dry earth fill the car. In his mind, he rehearsed angles, imagined how the shadows would fall against broken walls, how reflections might pool in stagnant water. He wasn't thinking about danger or isolation. If anything, he felt grounded, as though this trip would bring clarity he hadn't realized he was missing. By late morning, the road narrowed as it followed the curves of Gallatin Canyon. The terrain grew steeper, more rugged, the kind of place where cell service dropped without warning. Ethan noticed the familiar flicker of his phone searching for signal, then settling into silence. It didn't bother him. He'd been out of range before. In a way, he welcomed it. Being unreachable made the world feel simpler, reduced to what was directly in front of him. Rock faces rose sharply on either side, streaked with mineral stains and the shadows of passing clouds. Somewhere ahead, a dirt turnoff led toward Alder Creek. He slowed as he approached it, the tires crunching softly as he eased off the pavement. The path looked barely used, more suggestion than road, winding away into scrub and tall grass. Then hesitated for a moment, then turned onto it, guiding the sedan carefully over uneven ground. The car rocked slightly as it moved forward, dust rising behind him in a thin, drifting plume. He felt a small thrill, the sense of crossing an invisible threshold. Places like this always felt separate from ordinary time, as though once you entered them, the rules changed. He parked where the dirt road widened enough to turn around, shutting off the engine and sitting quietly for a few seconds. The silence pressed in immediately, broken only by wind moving through dry brush and the distant call of a bird. Ethan grabbed his camera bag and stepped out, closing the door behind him. He didn't lock the car. There was no one around, and he didn't plan to be gone long. He glanced toward the hills, then down the path leading deeper toward the remains of Alder Creek, partially hidden by the rise of the land. As he started walking, he felt that familiar tightening in his chest, not fear exactly, but anticipation. This was the moment he loved most, the approach when the subject was still unseen and full of possibility. He adjusted the strap of his camera bag, already thinking about his first shot. What Ethan didn't know, couldn't have known, was that this ordinary beginning, the quiet goodbye, the empty road, the casual promise to return was the last moment his life followed a predictable path. Somewhere beyond the bend in the dirt road, something else was already moving toward him, unseen, waiting for the moment when solitude turned into vulnerability. By early afternoon, time began to lose its shape. Ethan had been moving slowly through what remained of Alder Creek, stopping often, adjusting his lens, waiting for light to shift the way he wanted. The sun climbed higher, washing the ruins in a harsh brightness that flattened some angles and sharpened others. He worked around it patiently, framing doorways with no doors, windows staring blindly into weeds and dust, the quiet geometry of abandonment. When he checked his phone out of habit, the screen showed no signal, just the small, indifferent icon he'd seen 100 times before in places like this. He slipped it back into his pocket without concern and kept shooting. Somewhere between shots, he noticed the silence had changed. It wasn't louder or broken, if anything. It felt heavier, as though the canyon itself had inhaled and was holding its breath. The wind that had been moving through the brush earlier died down, leaving the air still and warm. Ethan paused, camera halfway raised, and listened. There was nothing concrete to hear, no footsteps or engines, but the absence itself pressed against him. He dismissed the feeling as fatigue or hunger. Long hours alone could do that, play tricks on perception. He took another photograph and forced himself to focus on the work. Around 2 in the afternoon, he decided to head back toward the car to swap film and grab some water. The walk back felt longer than it should have, the sun reflecting off pale dirt and bleached wood until everything blurred at the edges. When his phone vibrated briefly in his pocket, he stopped mid-step. It wasn't a call, just a flicker of life as the device caught a weak signal for a second before losing it again. Later, investigators would mark that moment as the last digital trace of Ethan Walker, a routine background update, nothing he initiated, nothing that suggested urgency. At the time, he barely registered it. The car came into view around a bend in the dirt road, its gray shape familiar and reassuring against the emptiness. Ethan felt a small, unconscious relief. He adjusted the strap of his bag and walked faster, already thinking about the shots he still wanted before leaving. He was close enough now to see the sunlight glint off the windshield. Then he noticed something that made him slow down. The car looked off. Not damaged, not obviously disturbed, but slightly misaligned, as if it had been nudged out of position. The angle of the tires didn't match how he remembered parking. Before he could fully process the thought, another shape registered in his peripheral vision. A vehicle stood farther down the dirt road, partially blocking the narrow exit back toward the pavement. It was large, taller than his sedan, dark against the brightness of the afternoon. Ethan stopped walking. For a moment he simply stared, trying to make sense of it. He hadn't heard anyone arrive. There had been no engine noise, no dust cloud announcing movement. The road was too narrow for 2 vehicles to pass easily. Whoever it was had pulled in close. His first instinct was irritation rather than fear. He assumed it was another explorer or a local who didn't appreciate strangers poking around. He considered calling out, then decided against it. Instead, he took a few cautious steps closer to his car, his attention flicking between the unfamiliar vehicle and the surrounding terrain. The canyon walls seemed steeper now, more enclosing. The openness he'd felt earlier had narrowed into something more confined. The space between the vehicles was shorter than he expected. Tire tracks in the dirt overlapped at odd angles, the heavier tread of the other vehicle cutting sharply across his own. Ethan's pulse quickened. This wasn't someone casually parking nearby. The placement was deliberate, too precise to be accidental. He reached for his phone again, this time with intention, and frowned when the screen showed no signal. The device felt suddenly useless in his hand. A door opened. The sound was unmistakable, the dull mechanical clunk echoing too loudly in the still air. Ethan looked up, his grip tightening on the camera strap. A man stepped out from the shadow of the larger vehicle, his movements unhurried. He didn't wave or speak. He simply stood there for a moment, as if assessing the scene. Ethan couldn't clearly make out his face at that distance, only the impression of height, the outline of broad shoulders, the way he occupied space with an unsettling calm. Ethan spoke first, his voice sounding thin in the open air. He said something neutral, a half question, half apology about being in the area to take photos. The words didn't matter. The man didn't respond right away. When he did, his tone was flat, almost conversational, asking where Ethan was headed, whether he'd been alone long. The questions felt wrong, not aggressive but probing, as if they were part of a script Ethan didn't know he'd stepped into. Instinct finally cut through confusion. Ethan took a step back toward his car, glancing at the driver's door. It was still closed. The man noticed the movement immediately. He shifted position, casually but effectively, narrowing the space between them. There was no raised voice, no sudden violence, just a subtle, undeniable control of the situation. Ethan's heart pounded so hard he could feel it in his throat. He realized then how isolated the canyon truly was, how easily sound could disappear into rock and distance. What happened next unfolded quickly, yet later would feel fragmented in Ethan's memory, reduced to flashes of sensation rather than a coherent sequence. A command delivered in a low voice, a hand gripping his arm with unexpected strength. The camera bag slipping from his shoulder and hitting the dirt with a soft, hollow sound. Ethan struggled, more out of reflex than strategy, his boots skidding on loose gravel. He shouted once, the sound raw and sharp, before it was cut off. The driver's door of the sedan was open now, though Ethan had no clear memory of opening it. The interior light glowed faintly despite the bright afternoon, the dashboard indicators still lit. Keys remained in the ignition, the engine silent. Later, those small details would haunt his family, stand as mute evidence of interruption rather than departure. In that moment, Ethan's focus narrowed to survival, to the overwhelming awareness that the situation had slipped beyond his control. The canyon absorbed everything, the scuffle, the broken branches, the sharp intake of breath as though it had been waiting for it. When the larger vehicle finally pulled away, its tires left deep, wide tracks pressed into the dirt, erasing any illusion that this had been a chance encounter. The road fell silent again, the wind eventually returning, brushing over disturbed ground and smoothing it just enough to conceal the urgency of what had occurred. By the time the sun dipped lower and shadows stretched across the canyon floor, Ethan's car remained where it was, door ajar, battery slowly draining its last power into a glowing dashboard. No one answered when his parents called his phone, no one saw him leave. To the outside world, he had simply vanished somewhere between morning enthusiasm and evening expectation, swallowed by a quiet stretch of land that offered no immediate answers. By the time the sun slipped behind the jagged rim of the canyon, the air had cooled into that fragile balance between evening and night, when everything looked suspended in amber light. Back in Bozeman, the Walkers' kitchen clock struck 6, and the silence inside the house felt heavier than usual. Ethan's mother, Marlene, stood by the window, wiping her hands on a towel as she glanced toward the driveway out of habit. The space where her son's car should have been remained empty. It wasn't like him to be late without texting. He had always been careful about that, almost obsessive, as if punctuality could make up for all the risks his hobby brought him. She reasoned with herself at first, maybe he'd stopped for food, maybe the light had been too good to leave early. But as the minutes folded into an hour, those explanations began to feel thin. His father, David, noticed her unease long before she said anything. He tried to reassure her the way fathers do, with logic. No service out there, he reminded her. You know how those canyons are. He's probably on his way back right now. Yet even he kept glancing at his phone, waiting for the buzz that never came. When darkness fully settled and the clock hit 8, David set down his coffee mug and quietly fetched his keys. I'll drive out a bit, just to check the main road, he said, trying to make it sound casual. Marlene didn't argue. She only nodded, though her hands trembled as she reached for the phone again, refreshing the screen as if signal alone could will a message to appear. The drive out of town took less than an hour, but it stretched endlessly in David's mind. The highway unfurled through black stretches of pine and shadow, punctuated only by the occasional glint of headlights from distant cars. He kept glancing toward the side roads, straining to recognize any turnoff his son might have taken. When he reached the mouth of Gallatin Canyon, he slowed, searching for tire marks, dust trails, any sign of movement. It was there, half hidden behind a railroad embankment, that a dull metallic reflection caught his eye. He braked hard, gravel crunching beneath the tires, and backed up slowly until his headlights washed over the shape. His heart seized. It was Ethan's car. At first glance, the vehicle looked merely stranded, the silver paint dulled by a fine layer of dust, one door slightly open. But as David approached, flashlight in hand, unease bloomed into dread. The keys were still in the ignition. The dashboard lights glowed weakly, the battery nearly dead. Inside, the car was a mess, a chaotic scattering of maps and empty film canisters. Ethan was meticulous about his gear. He never left things in disarray. His backpack was gone, as were his phone and wallet. The passenger seat held only a crumpled map marked with small circles and notes in his handwriting. The sight felt wrong in a way David couldn't fully articulate it. It was the absence that hurt most, the unnatural stillness of something that should have been temporary. He called out his son's name, once, then again louder. His voice echoed off the canyon walls and came back empty. The wind had started to rise, pushing through dry brush and making the darkness move. For a long moment he just stood there, scanning the ground with the flashlight, unwilling to let panic take hold. Then he saw it, the faint outline of tire tracks in the dirt, wider than those of Ethan's sedan. They curved sharply in front of the car, overlapping his son's tracks as though cutting him off. David crouched down, tracing the grooves with his fingers. They led toward the main road and disappeared into rough gravel. Something inside him broke open. He didn't need training to understand what that meant. By the time deputies from Gallatin County arrived, it was past 9. The place looked almost otherworldly under the harsh white beams of their floodlights, every grain of dust throwing back light like powdered glass. The officers sealed the area quickly, marking perimeters with tape and photographing the scene. They spoke in low, deliberate tones, but David barely heard them. He stood near the car, arms folded tightly, watching as they examined every inch of ground for footprints, for anything that might explain what had happened. The sheriff, an older man named Collins, approached him gently, asking when he'd last spoken to Ethan. "This morning," David said, his voice cracking. "He said he'd be home by 5. Collins nodded, jotting something down. "We'll start the search tonight," he promised, though the wariness in his eyes betrayed years of knowing how fragile those words could be. As the first sweep teams arrived, dog handlers, local volunteers, search and rescue specialists, the canyon filled with beams of moving light. They fanned out from the car in widening circles, calling Ethan's name into the darkness. The dogs barked and strained at their leashes, noses low to the ground, but the scent dissolved quickly in the dry wind. Every lead ended the same way, at the spot where those unfamiliar tire marks vanished. Beyond that, the desert swallowed all trace. The night air turned colder, sharper, and with it came the unspoken realization that the first hours were slipping away. In cases like this, the golden window of finding someone alive closed fast. Back at the scene, Marlene arrived around midnight, after refusing to stay home any longer. Her face was pale, her hands clutching the photograph she'd taken from the refrigerator door, Ethan smiling on his 21st birthday, cake half eaten, camera slung around his neck. When she saw the car, she didn't cry immediately. She just stared at it, as if trying to absorb every detail before her mind accepted what her eyes already knew. The sheriff spoke softly to her, explaining procedures, assuring her that search efforts would continue through dawn. She nodded mechanically, but her gaze kept drifting toward the open door of the sedan, toward the faint, fading light of the dashboard. As the night deepened, the canyon took on a surreal stillness. Generators hummed, radios crackled with clipped updates, and somewhere in the distance a coyote cried out. David sat on the tailgate of a patrol truck, head bowed, exhaustion numbing him into silence. Every sound, the crunch of boots, the static of walkie-talkies, felt too loud against the vast quiet. He kept replaying the morning in his mind, Ethan's casual goodbye, the promise to be back for dinner, the way sunlight had caught his son's hair as he stepped through the door. It all seemed ordinary then, but ordinary things had a way of fracturing under hindsight. Near dawn, the search teams returned empty-handed. The sheriff called a temporary halt, promising to resume at first light. As vehicles pulled away, the headlights stretched long shadows across the gravel road, passing over the silver car that now stood like a monument to interruption. David and Marlene didn't leave. They sat together in their truck, holding hands in silence, watching the horizon pale slowly to gray. The wind shifted again, carrying the faint smell of dust and engine oil. Somewhere, a train passed far off, its low rumble fading into the distance. It was the only sound left. When the first light of morning touched the canyon walls, it revealed what the darkness had hidden, the raw emptiness of a place that had simply taken and given nothing back. Ethan Walker was gone, and in his absence the land seemed to hold its own grim secret. The search would continue for days, weeks even, but the truth had already begun to sink in. Whatever had happened on that lonely stretch of dirt road, it had moved with precision, leaving behind just enough evidence to prove it existed and not enough to explain why. The following day rose cold and colorless, the kind of morning that seemed unwilling to start. The canyon looked different under daylight, less like a crime scene, more like an indifferent stretch of wilderness that had seen too much and remembered nothing. Investigators arrived early, their boots crunching across the gravel as they began their slow, methodical work. The silver sand said exactly as David had left it, a silent witness surrounded by yellow tape. Photographers circled the area, capturing every angle: the open door, the scuffed ground, the faint indentations of tires that did not belong to Ethan's car. The sun glinted off the windshield, reflecting nothing but emptiness. It was as if the earth had swallowed whatever truth it once held. Detective Sam Harlan took charge of the scene, a tall man with the wary posture of someone who'd seen too many disappearances and not enough resolutions. He studied the vehicle in silence before crouching near the tire marks. The ground here was dry, a mix of compact dirt and loose pebbles, difficult to read but not impossible. Two sets of tracks were visible: Ethan's, narrow and even, and another, much wider, with a deeper groove pattern that suggested something heavier, a van or a large truck. What caught Harlan's attention wasn't just the width, but the placement. The second vehicle hadn't simply parked beside Ethan's. It had pulled in close, nose angled sharply, blocking the path forward. To anyone familiar with roadside dynamics, it looked deliberate, the kind of maneuver meant to stop someone from leaving. He ran a gloved hand over the prints, measuring the distance between them. "Aggressive stop," he muttered to the forensic tech beside him. "No skid marks. The kid didn't try to back out or accelerate. Means he probably stopped on his own or someone made him." The tech nodded, jotting notes on a clipboard. Harlan straightened up and looked around. The canyon walls rose steep and even, cutting off sound and sightlines, a perfect place for something to happen unnoticed. He walked a few yards away from the car, scanning the perimeter. A cluster of brittle sagebrush showed broken branches, as though someone or something had moved quickly through them. He followed the disturbance a few feet until it ended abruptly at bare rock. No blood, no dropped items, no signs of struggle beyond those broken stems. Just a void where movement had stopped. Back by the car, another officer was cataloging the contents of the vehicle. The map on the passenger seat was spread open to a page, marked with small circles, likely locations Ethan had planned to shoot. A bottle of water sat in the cup holder, half empty, condensation dried to a faint ring. The back seat was mostly clear except for a few spare film rolls scattered on the floor mat. It wasn't much, but Harlan had learned that even nothing could be something. He glanced at the ignition. The keys were still there, turned halfway. The battery had drained overnight, leaving the dashboard lights dim and flickering. The image unsettled him. Someone steps out for just a minute, door open, engine running, maybe planning to come right back and then never does. He turned to David and Marlene, who stood a few yards away, flanked by a deputy. Their faces were drawn tight, the exhaustion of the night etched into every line. Harlan approached carefully, his voice low. "We're redoing everything we can," he said, though the words felt inadequate. David nodded, his expression blank. Marlene just kept her eyes fixed on the car, as if looking hard enough might make her son reappear. "Did Ethan ever mention anyone joining him yesterday?" Harlan asked gently. "Any friend, housemates, anyone he might have planned to meet?" David shook his head. "He worked alone, always did." The detective wrote that down, but didn't look satisfied. "All right, we'll start canvassing. There's a few people who live along the highway, ranchers, truckers. Someone might be seen a vehicle that doesn't belong." As the day stretched on, the investigation widened beyond the canyon. Patrol cars fanned out along Highway 91, stopping at gas stations and rest stops, showing photos of Ethan and his car to anyone who'd look. Most people hadn't seen anything unusual. A few remembered a silver sedan heading west early that morning, but none recalled another vehicle following it. It was the kind of case that began to rot quickly under daylight, too many empty answers, too much silence. The media caught wind by evening, and local news vans soon lined the edge of the search zone. A missing college student made for sympathetic headlines, but the coverage only deepened the family's sense of unreality. Cameras filmed the canyon, the car, the sheriff's office press conference where Harlan spoke in careful, procedural tones about continuing efforts and all possible leads. Behind those phrases, everyone could feel the same hollow truth: they had no idea where Ethan Walker had gone. That night, the forensic team delivered their first analysis of the tire impressions. The pattern matched a type commonly found on older utility vans, Chevrolet or Ford models from the late 1980s or early 90s. That narrowed the field, but not by much. There were hundreds of such vehicles still scattered across Montana's rural counties, used by contractors, delivery men, even hobby collectors. Still, Harlan felt a flicker of interest. "Get me the DEMV database," he told his assistant. "Cross-check for dark-colored vans registered in Gallatin and the next 2 counties over. Start with any that don't have updated inspections." It was a long shot, but long shots were often the only kind available. As the search teams returned to the canyon for another sweep, the tone had shifted. The first night's urgency gave way to grim persistence. They combed through brush, dragged shallow streams, even sent drones to scan the terrain from above. The canyon offered nothing. Dogs picked faint traces that vanished after a few hundred yards, as though the trail itself had been erased. One handler said quietly to another that the ground felt dead, a word that hung in the air long after it was spoken. By the second sunset, even the sheriff's optimism had dulled. He called for a temporary suspension until morning, promising to bring in additional personnel from neighboring counties. The walkers watched the lights fade one by one as the last vehicle left the site. The emptiness that followed felt larger than the landscape itself. Later, when Harlan finally returned to his office, the evidence board above his desk was already filling with photographs: the car, the tire casts, the map, the barren stretch of canyon road. He pinned Ethan's photo in the center, a smiling young man with clear eyes and a camera strap across his shoulder, and stared at it for a long time. "You didn't just vanish," he muttered under his breath. "Someone made sure of that. But the question, as always, was who and why." Over the next few days, the investigation tightened around that single piece of physical evidence: the overlapping tire tracks. Experts compared the casts to regional tire sales, narrowing possibilities, but nothing led anywhere concrete. Every test came back inconclusive. The soil was too dry to hold clear impressions. Even the tread size, at first their strongest lead, matched too many vehicles to isolate one. Harlan began to feel the slow drag of futility creeping in. He'd seen this pattern before: the longer a person stayed missing, the smaller the chance of bringing them back alive. He tried not to think about that when he called the walkers each evening to give updates that sounded more like apologies. By the end of the week, the site had grown quiet again. The police tape fluttered in the breeze, half buried under dust. The only visible remnants of the search were footprints and the faint, ghostly tire marks pressed into the gravel, the same marks that had told the story no one could finish. The canyon, indifferent as always, began to reclaim its silence. To anyone passing by, it looked like nothing had happened there at all. But for those who'd seen it under floodlights, who'd stood beside that open car door in the dark, it was impossible to forget how the ground had once looked disturbed, as if it had swallowed something whole. 2 days after the disappearance, the search widened beyond the canyon. What had begun as a rescue mission was quietly becoming something else: a criminal investigation without a body. Detective Harlan sat in the small conference room of the Gallatin County Sheriff's Office, surrounded by half-empty coffee cups and aerial maps pinned to the wall. The air smelled of burnt caffeine and paper. He rubbed the bridge of his nose as the latest report came in from the tech team. Ethan Walker's phone had gone dark at 114 p.m. on the day he vanished. The last signal came from a tower near the entrance to Gallatin Canyon, precisely where the dirt road to Alder Creek began. After that, nothing: no calls, no texts, no pings. Harlan didn't need to be told what that meant. Phones died in the wilderness all the time, but when a college kid vanished with his car left running, a phone going silent wasn't coincidence, it was control. By mid-morning, investigators began to map Ethan's social circle: friends, classmates, professors, anyone who might have known his plans that day. The list wasn't long. Ethan was private, the kind of student who preferred late nights in the campus darkroom over parties or small talk. But one name came up more than once: Lucas Reed. Several students at the photography department mentioned that Lucas and Ethan hadn't been on good terms lately. They used to work together, one girl told the detectives, twisting a pen nervously between her fingers. But then they had this fight. Something about a final project idea. Lucas thought Ethan stole his concept. Harlan asked when this happened. 2 days before he disappeared. She said they argued in the cafeteria. Everyone heard it. That got his attention. A disagreement was one thing, a public threat was another. Another student backed up the account, repeating almost the same words as Luke had shouted, "You'll regret it if you go out there before I do." Simple frustration maybe, but spoken in front of witnesses, it sounded like motive. Harlan leaned back in his chair, his mind already building the outline. Jealousy, rivalry, a confrontation that went too far. It wasn't hard to imagine. He'd seen it before: youth, ego, a moment of anger that spiraled into panic. The missing camera gear and backpack could fit that narrative too. Maybe Lucas had taken them after an argument gone wrong. It wasn't proof, but it was the first thread of coherence the case had offered in days. By noon, Harlan signed off on a warrant request for Lucas Reed's phone records and vehicle search. Lucas lived in a student apartment near the university, a 2-story building with peeling paint and overgrown hedges. When detectives knocked on his door, he answered wearing headphones, surprised but not alarmed. He was tall, thin, with the pale skin of someone who spent too much time under fluorescent light. At first, he seemed confused about why the police were there. When Harlan introduced himself and mentioned Ethan's name, Lucas's expression tightened just slightly. "Yeah, I heard," he said, voice flat. "Terrible thing. But I don't know what that's got to do with me." Harlan explained the situation calmly, mentioning the witnesses, the argument, and the timeline. Lucas's defensiveness rose immediately. "Look, it was nothing," he insisted. "Just talk. Everyone gets heated. He stole my concept, okay? I said something I shouldn't have. That doesn't mean he stopped." Catching himself, "I didn't see him that day. I was home. You can ask anyone." The detective noted the shift, the instinctive denial before the question was even fully asked. It wasn't guilt necessarily, but it was fear of implication. With a warrant in hand, they asked to see his vehicle, a dark blue pickup truck parked in the lot behind the building. Harlan circled it slowly, eyes scanning every detail. The tires caught his attention first, wide, heavy treated, not unlike the impressions from the canyon. He crouched, brushing away a layer of dried clay caked along the fenders. It was a deep reddish color, fine-grained, sticking stubbornly to the metal. Harlan's mind clicked. The canyon soil near Alder Creek wasn't red, it was pale tan. But 20 miles south, near the old flooded mining fields, the clay turned that exact rust color. Lucas saw where the detective's gaze had landed and shifted uneasily. "That's from a hiking trip," he offered quickly, "a week ago." His tone sounded rehearsed, as if he'd already considered what excuse to give. Harlan didn't reply. He just nodded to the forensic team to start collecting samples. Back inside, Lucas's composure began to fracture. He spoke in circles. Yes, he'd known Ethan was going to Alder Creek. Yes, he'd thought about going there too. No, he hadn't actually done it. When confronted with the phone records showing his device connecting to the same tower as Ethan's that afternoon, his mouth went dry. "That doesn't mean anything," he stammered. "That tower covers half the county." Then came the detail that changed everything. After 10 p.m. Lucas's phone had gone completely offline for nearly 2 hours. The signal didn't return until 3:00 when it reconnected near the edge of Bozeman. 2 hours, Harlan said quietly. "Long time for a dead battery." Lucas looked away, jaw tightening. "I turned it off," he admitted. "I needed some quiet. I was driving around, thinking." "Driving where?" Harlan asked. "I don't remember, just out." It wasn't much of an alibi, and Harlan knew it. The red clay, the overlapping tower data, the timing, it all lined up too neatly to ignore. They brought Lucas in for questioning. For the first hour, he stayed combative, insisting the police were wasting time. But when the detective placed photos of his truck on the table, highlighting the matching tire treads, his confidence faltered. He leaned back in the chair, exhaling sharply. "Fine," he said. "Yeah, I went out there. I wanted to talk to him, that's all. I thought maybe we could clear things up, or maybe I just wanted him to know I was serious. But I never found him. I drove around a bit and came home, that's it." Harlan studied him in silence. "You wanted to talk to him," he repeated. "About what?" Lucas hesitated about the project, about him stealing my idea. Look, I was pissed, okay? But I didn't hurt him. When I got there, I couldn't find his car. I figured he hadn't come yet. I left. The statement was neat, maybe too neat. Still, without physical evidence, no blood, no fibers, no fingerprints, they couldn't hold him. The forensics lab later confirmed that while the clay on his truck matched samples from the region, it was too generic to prove direct connection. The tire tread was similar to dozens of models on the market. Circumstantial, not conclusive. By the end of the week, the county prosecutor refused to issue charges. Harlan had to release Lucas Reed. The decision gnawed at him. He'd been sure, almost viscerally, that the kid knew more than he was saying. But the law didn't bend for gut feelings. Lucas walked out of the station that evening, his face pale under the flickering hallway lights. Reporters waited outside, throwing questions. He said nothing. Harlan watched him leave through the blinds of his office, jaw set. The kid might have been innocent, or he might have been lucky. Either way, Ethan Walker was still gone, and the canyon still held its silence. Sometimes, in cases like this, the truth didn't vanish, it just waited, buried under layers of dust and time, until someone was desperate enough to dig it up. Days bled into weeks, and the town of Bozeman began to absorb the absence like an old wound. At first, the case of the missing photography student stayed on everyone's lips, his name whispered in grocery lines, murmured in coffee shops, printed beneath grainy photographs on posters stapled to telephone poles. But as the first weeks of searching turned into a month, the noise dimmed, replaced by the dull hum of everyday life. Only for the Walker family and for Detective Sam Harlan, the silence was unbearable. It wasn't just the lack of leads, it was the feeling that the ground itself had swallowed its secret and refused to give it back. Search teams combed the canyon daily for nearly 3 weeks. Volunteers from nearby counties joined the effort, some out of empathy, others chasing the faint hope of being the one to find something, anything. They scoured every bend in the dirt road where Ethan's car had been discovered, traced the edges of gullies, combed through dry riverbeds. Helicopters swept low across the terrain, their searchlights carving bright white circles into the dust. From above, the canyon looked small, almost harmless, but on the ground it stretched endlessly, a maze of dry rock and shadows. Each morning Harlan arrived before dawn, watching as the first light cut across the cliffs. He'd stand by the silver sedan still impounded near the scene for analysis and study it as though repetition could unlock something new. The air carried the metallic scent of heat and dust, the faint echo of dogs barking down in the lower ridge. Every inch of the vehicle had been processed, photographed, catalogued, yet none of it explained why a careful, cautious young man had vanished without a sound. The case reports filled binders, the interviews stacked on his desk, but none of it moved the investigation forward. When the press conferences stopped drawing crowds, the search teams began to thin. By the start of the second month, only the Corps officers and a few stubborn volunteers remained. The Walkers still came to the command post every morning, Marlene with her thermos of coffee, David with a flashlight he never seemed to put down. Harlan admired their endurance even as he dreaded their quiet questions. Any news today? The only answer he had left was the one that hurt the most. No, nothing new. Eventually, the sheriff's office had to face the grim arithmetic of resources. After 40 days, the official ground search was scaled back. The last press release used careful language, suspending active field operations pending new evidence, but everyone knew what it meant. The case was turning cold. At home, the Walkers kept the search alive on their own. They built a website, set up a hotline, printed thousands of flyers. The bright, smiling face of their son stared from every lamppost in town. His story spread through social media, drawing attention from strangers across the country. Some offered help, others claimed visions, psychic insights, coordinates scrawled on napkins mailed from out of state. Every envelope brought hope and disappointment in equal measure. David checked each one personally, driving out to dead-end dirt roads and long abandoned barns just to be sure. He'd return at dusk, his truck coated in dust, the same empty look in his eyes. Harlan, meanwhile, refused to let go of the Lucas Reed angle. The kid had walked free, but the detective couldn't shake the feeling that something in his story didn't fit. He ran background checks again, re-examined every timestamp, every route. Reed's alibi held technically, but not emotionally. It lacked the messiness of truth. Still, the trail was cold, and the prosecutor's office had closed the file on him. Without a body, without proof of violence, Harlan's suspicions carried no weight. He began exploring alternative possibilities: wildlife attack, accidental fall, even voluntary disappearance. None of them sat right. Ethan had left behind everything he cared about: his gear, his car, his parents waiting for him. People who vanish on purpose don't leave their world so neatly behind. What haunted Harlan most were the tire tracks. They told of storyicles meeting in that desolate place, one small, one large, and only one leaving. Every time he looked at the photographs, he saw choreography, not chaos. Whoever had been there with Ethan hadn't acted out of panic. It had been planned. 3 months in, the canyon turned to ice. Early snow swept across Montana, dusting the cliffs with white and filling the air with the brittle scent of winter. The searchers retreated. Snow erased everything: the footprints, the dust trails, even the faint outlines of tire marks. The world seemed determined to hide whatever had happened. Harlan filed his final report of the season, noting no recovery, no body, investigation pending. On the corner of the document, the sheriff's clerk stamped it with 2 words that cut like frostbite: a case inactive. The Walkers refused to believe it was over. They kept Ethan's room exactly as he'd left it: clothes folded on the chair, unfinished coffee mug on the desk, camera manual stacked beside the bed. Sometimes Marlene would sit there in the evenings, scrolling through his photos on the old computer, searching for hidden messages in the light and shadows. David grew quieter, more methodical, channeling his grief into action, meeting with private investigators, contacting search and rescue volunteers from other states. One of them, a retired ranger, told him something that stuck: canyons like that don't give back unless they're ready. But they never keep secrets forever. Winter dragged on. The phone rarely rang anymore. Even the detective moved on to other cases: robberies, domestic disputes, the usual cycle of ordinary crime. But every time Harlan drove past Gallatin Canyon, he felt the same pull, the same unspoken challenge from the landscape. He'd pull over occasionally, step out of his car, and listen. The wind down there had a voice like a whisper through stone, low and steady, carrying nothing but cold. By the first anniversary of the disappearance, the story had faded from headlines entirely. Ethan Walker became another statistic, one more missing person in a state full of wild places that devoured the careless and unlucky alike. His parents stopped attending public vigils, the posters peeled away from telephone poles, their edges bleached white by sun. But grief is a strange kind of persistence. The Walkers learned to live around it, as if life had been divided into 2 distinct halves before Ethan vanished and after. Harlan filed the last of the reports into the archive, the folder marked with the simple tag "missing undetermined." Still, he couldn't bring himself to seal it completely. Every now and then, he'd take it out, flipping through the pages as if a detail might suddenly rearrange itself into meaning. He couldn't accept that a man could disappear so completely, not in daylight, not with tire marks still etched in the dirt. Something was unfinished. He felt it in his bones. And so the canyon kept its silence through the long winter, the dust now layered with snow, the sagebrush brittle and white. When spring returned and the meltwater began to run again through the gullies, a few hikers noticed how quiet the area remained. No birds, no tracks, just the wind curling through the empty spaces where Ethan Walker had last stood. Whatever had happened that day was buried deeper than anyone imagined, and it would take more than luck or time to bring it back to the surface. 13 months later, the story of Ethan Walker existed only as a memory. People recalled in half sentences something that had happened a while back. A local tragedy folded neatly into the long list of Montana's unsolved disappearances. His parents still kept his photo framed in the living room, the corners of the picture worn soft from touch. But even they had stopped expecting the phone to ring. Time had done what it always does: it dulled the edges of grief until it felt almost manageable. And then, one October evening, the past clawed its way back to the surface from a place no one would have dared to look. It began with a group of trespassers. They were amateur explorers, the kind of thrill seekers who posted videos of abandoned places online for a handful of views. There were 4 of them, 2 locals from Redmond and a couple from out of state. They called themselves urban archaeologists, though their adventures were more about adrenaline than history. That night they chose the Silver Hollow salt mine, an industrial site shut down in mid-1990s and left to decay beneath layers of red dust and bureaucratic neglect. Officially, the mine had been sealed years earlier after several collapses. Unofficially, there were still ways in if you knew where to look. They arrived just after sunset, their pickup loaded with flashlights, cameras, and a cooler of cheap beer. The entrance they used was an old ventilation shaft behind a collapsed fence, a narrow hole that dropped 20 feet before opening into one of the upper tunnels. The descent was slow, awkward, and dangerous. Rusted ladders groaned under their weight, and flakes of salt rained down from the walls with each movement. Once inside, the group fanned their lights across the cavern. The air shimmered with suspended dust, glittering like frost in the beams. The mine stretched endlessly in both directions, old rail tracks disappearing into darkness. At first, it was everything they hoped for: eerie, cinematic, perfectly desolate. They filmed short clips for their channel, joking about ghosts and miners who never clocked out. But as they moved deeper, the atmosphere shifted. The air grew heavier, drier, almost sterile. Their voices echoed too clearly, bouncing off salt-crusted walls until it sounded like the mine itself was mocking them. One of the men direct suggested heading down to a lower level marked Horizon 4 on an old map he'd found online. "That's where the good stuff will be," he said. Against their better judgment, they followed. The descent took them through a maze of narrow tunnels, some partially collapsed, others opening into vast chambers where abandoned carts sat frozen on rails. The deeper they went, the colder it became, but not with the kind of cold that came from air. It was the cold of something ancient and untouched. Their flashlights picked up crystals blooming from the walls, white and sharp as bone. The silence down there felt wrong, too complete, as if sound had been sucked out of the air. They were nearly ready to turn back when one of the women, Lee, noticed a splash of color ahead, a blot of yellow breaking the endless gray. At first, she thought it was paint or fabric left behind by other explorers. But as her light steadied on it, the shape resolved into something disturbingly human. A figure sat slumped against the wall at the end of the tunnel, half illuminated by the harsh white glow of their flashlights. The group froze, their laughter dying instantly. For a long moment, no one spoke. Derek stepped forward cautiously, his boots crunching on salt crystals. "It's a mannequin," he said, half trying to convince himself. Like some kind of prank. But when he reached out with the end of his flashlight to nudge the figure's shoulder, the sound that came back wasn't the hollow clatter of plastic. It was the soft rasp of fabric and something brittle underneath, like parchment cracking. Lee gasped and stumbled backward. "Oh my God," she whispered, "that's not fake." The figure was a man, long dead but unnervingly intact. The salt had mummified him, drawing every trace of moisture from his body until the skin clung tight to the bones. What truly froze them wasn't the preservation, it was the clothing. The body was dressed in a vintage clown costume, bright yellow fabric dulled by dust but still vibrant against the gray stone. A painted grin stretched across the face beneath a thin layer of powder, red mouth wide, eyes shadowed with black diamonds. The expression was grotesquely serene, like a performer caught mid-bow. The explorers fled in chaos, scrambling up the ladders and out through the shaft, gasping for air as they burst into the cold night. One of them managed to dial 9911 between sobs. "There's a body," he said, "in the mine. He's dressed like a clown." Within an hour, the area was crawling with law enforcement. Floodlights lit up the entrance, and rescue teams prepared for extraction. The operation took all night. The tunnels were unstable, the air thick with fine salt that clogged filters and burned throats. But by dawn, the body was brought to the surface, sealed in a black recovery bag coated in white dust. Detective Harlan got the call at 5:17 a.m. When he arrived, the scene looked unreal, like a film set built for tragedy. He stood beside the coroner's van as the bag was unzipped. Even after all his years on the job, the sight stole his breath. The body's face was eerily preserved, skin stiff and pale beneath the makeup. The yellow costume faintly under the floodlights, heavy brocade that spoke of craftsmanship, not cheap novelty. "Jesus Christ," one of the deputies muttered. "Who would do something like this?" Harlan didn't answer, his gaze fixed on the victim's hair, the curve of the jaw. There was something familiar there, though distorted by time and death. He turned to the coroner. "Get me dental records from the Walker case," he said quietly. "Now." Hours later, the confirmation came through. It was Ethan Walker. The boy who had vanished from Gallatin Canyon a year earlier had been found nearly 100 miles away, sitting in the dark depths of a forgotten salt mine, dressed as something between a jester and a corpse. The official report described the condition of the remains as salt mummification, but that clinical term did little to capture the horror of it. Every detail, the costume, the makeup, the posture, spoke not of panic or accident, but of arrangement. Someone had taken time, care, even artistry. The discovery sent shockwaves through the department. The media swarmed back into town, resurrecting old headlines with morbid enthusiasm. The Walkers were notified in person. Marlene collapsed before the detective could finish his sentence. David just stared at Harlan with the hollow eyes of a man who had already known, deep down, that this was how it would end. For the rest of that week, Harlan couldn't shake the image of the yellow fabric against the gray salt. It wasn't random, it wasn't opportunistic. It was theatrical. Whoever had done this hadn't just wanted Ethan dead, they'd wanted to stage him. And that realization chilled Harlan more than the mine's subterranean air ever could. It meant that somewhere out there was a person who saw death as art, who'd looked at a human being and thought in terms of lighting, costume, and composition. He looked over the mine map later that night, tracing the route the explorers had taken. The spot where Ethan had been found wasn't a dumping site. It was chosen a narrow alcove carved by hand, its walls smooth, the floor level. Harlan pictured the killer working there by lantern light, the body positioned just so, the makeup applied with patience. It was madness, but precise madness. The investigation that followed would unravel that precision piece by piece. But for now, as Harlan sat alone in his car outside the coroner's office, the first hard truth settled in his chest like lead. Ethan Walker hadn't been lost to the wilderness. He'd been claimed by someone who wanted to make sure the world would remember him exactly this way, frozen, smiling, and silent. The autopsy began 2 days later in a sterile room at the Montana State Medical Examiner's office in Helena. Outside, the sky was low and heavy with rain, the kind of weather that felt indecently calm compared to what was happening inside. The medical examiner, Dreer. Lila Mendoza worked quietly, her movements deliberate, almost reverent. She had been in this profession long enough to know when a case was ordinary and when it demanded silence. Ethan Walker's body was not merely a corpse, it was a message someone had left behind. The salt had done its work well. His features were eerily preserved, the skin taut, colorless, and papery, yet unmistakably human. His eyelids had sealed shut, but beneath the cracked grace paint, the faint outlines of his face remained. He looked neither alive nor dead, just suspended, as though the act of dying had been paused. Detective Harlan stood behind the glass partition, watching through the observation window. He'd been in countless autopsies, but this one felt different. The air was colder, sharper, heavy with the chemical tang of disinfectant and something else, something ancient, like stone dust. When Mendoza began cutting through the stiff fabric of the yellow costume, the sound was almost unbearable, a slow tearing that echoed faintly off the tiled walls. Beneath the outer layer, she found more fabric, an underlining of thick cotton, than beneath that skin drawn so tight over bone it looked sculpted. The first real revelation came from the wrists. Hidden beneath the broad cuffs of the costume were marks, deep indentations in the flesh, not from decay but from restraint. At first glance they appeared as simple ligature bruises, but under magnification the pattern was far too intricate. It wasn't the crude twist of rope tied in panic. The cords had been wound in deliberate loops, interlaced with precision, using a complex knotting method meant to restrict movement without immediately cutting off circulation. Mendoza paused, brow furrowing. "That's not random," she said softly. "Whoever did this knew exactly what they were doing." She motioned for a camera, capturing close-ups of the knot impressions. The pattern reminded her of something, though she couldn't place it immediately. Later, she'd remember it was similar to the bindings used in professional stage rigging and aerial performance harnesses, the kind designed to hold weight and maintain control. She noted it in her report. The binding technique indicates advanced familiarity with theatrical or climbing knots. When Harlan heard that, something inside him shifted. He stepped into the lab, ignoring protocol. "You re-saying he was tied up by someone trained?" Mendoza nodded. "Not trained in restraint, trained in structure. This was designed to keep him still but alive. Whoever tied these wanted him to stay conscious, at least for a while." The room seemed to shrink around that single implication. The next discovery was even more disturbing. Beneath the layers of makeup on Ethan's face, traces of older pigment remained. Mendoza used a solvent to gently remove the surface paint, revealing layers beneath white base, red around the mouth, then faint streaks of blue. Whoever applied it had done so professionally, blending colors in a way that suggested experience with stage lighting. "This isn't Halloween paint," she murmured. "It's grease paint, theatrical grade, the kind used under spotlights." Harlan said nothing, but his stomach turned. The costume, the knots, the makeup, it was all deliberate, all crafted. He imagined the killer hunched over the body, working with methodical focus, transforming a dead boy into something grotesquely beautiful. So it wasn't random violence, it was performance. When the clothing was finally removed, the full story of Ethan's final moments began to emerge. The lack of fractures suggested no overt struggle. Toxicology tests later confirmed the presence of a sedative powerful, but not instantly lethal, enough to immobilize him. That meant Ethan might have been conscious when he was dressed, painted, and bound. Harlan couldn't get the image out of his head, the flicker of a lantern, the brush moving across skin, the quiet hum of someone lost in their own ritual. Mendoza finished her examination around midnight. When she peeled off her gloves, her voice was quiet but steady. He wasn't killed there. He was posed after death. Whoever did this wanted him preserved, not hidden. She turned to the detective, her eyes dark with exhaustion. That costume, it's old handmade, late 80s, maybe early 90s. See the stitching, no machine work. Someone cared about the detail. That night, Harlan returned to his office and laid out every photo from the autopsy on his desk. Under the harsh desk lamp, the yellow costume seemed to glow faintly, as if mocking him. The design was elaborate, heavy brocade fabric, edges hand-hemmed, seams reinforced with thick thread. It looked like something that belonged under a circus tent, not in a grave. He flipped through crime scene photos of the miner, the smooth, almost ceremonial alcove where Ethan had been found. The way his body had been positioned upright, hands bound behind him, head tilted just slightly downward. It was theatrical in every sense. Whoever staged it had treated that salt chamber like a stage. Harlan couldn't shake the idea that this wasn't the first time the killer had done it. The precision, the craftsmanship, the confidence, it spoke of experience. He began calling every regional department within 100 miles, asking about old cases involving missing persons, stage costumes, or abandoned theaters. Most calls led nowhere, but one night while reviewing archived property records, he found a faint connection. The mine where Ethan was discovered had once been located near a small traveling showground, long defunct. In the late 1980s, it had hosted a troupe known as the Midland Wonder Show, a ragtag circus that had toured across the western states before dissolving in financial ruin. The name lingered in Harlan's mind. He started searching deeper, digging through public archives and old newspaper clippings. The Midland Wonder Show wasn't famous, but it left a faint trail, a few promotional posters, faded reviews from local papers. One grainy photograph stopped him cold. It showed a group of performers standing before a striped tent. At the center was a man in a yellow clown suit, his painted grin wide, his eyes outlined in black. The costume wasn't identical, but close enough to make his blood run cold. When Harlan printed the photo and placed it beside the images of the outfit found on Ethan's body, the similarities were undeniable. The same cut, same brocade texture, same pattern of stitching. The difference was in the wear. The costume from the photo looked new, vibrant. Ethan's was aged, repaired, faded by time. It meant the killer hadn't just replicated the look. He had the original. It was around that time that the first whisper of a new theory began to form. Maybe this wasn't about Ethan at all. Maybe he was chosen because of something larger, something connected to the relics of a forgotten world of performers, costumes, and traveling caravans. Whoever had taken him hadn't merely murdered him, they had resurrected a piece of that lost stage and placed him inside it. By dawn, Harlan was still at his desk, the photograph of the old troupe beside the autopsy file. The rain had stopped, leaving the window fogged over. He stared at the two images, the decades between them collapsing into a single truth he didn't yet understand. Somewhere out there was someone who had never stopped performing, someone who believed that the stage hadn't ended when the audience left. And now they had an audience again. Him. When dawn broke over Helena the next morning, the sky was washed in a pale gray, a color that felt closer to exhaustion than light. Detective Harlan sat in his office, the photographs from the autopsy still spread across his desk, half buried under reports, coffee, stained notes, and the old circus poster he'd found online the night before. The yellow costume stared back at him from every angle, taunting him with the same unanswered question: who could have done this? The forensics report had finally arrived that morning, thick as a small novel, but buried halfway through was the detail that changed everything. The knots, the precise, intricate bindings that held Ethan's wrists, had been tied in a way consistent with performance rigging. It's not just any kind, either. The analyst specified aerial performance or stage harness techniques, typically used by professionals in acrobatics or circus disciplines. Harlan read that sentence 3 times. He'd spent decades in law enforcement, but in all that time, he had never seen a murder where the evidence pointed to someone with a background in performance art. It was too specific, too strange. Most killers were sloppy. Here they left fingerprints, fibers, or panic. This one had left choreography. He flipped to the next page and found a list of possible knot classifications, each labeled with technical terms: Prozac, alpine butterfly, figure 8 follow through. The documentation was so detailed it read like a manual. He felt his pulse quicken as an image formed in his mind, a person with years of muscle memory, hands moving by instinct, not thought. Whoever this was, they hadn't learned it from YouTube tutorials. He leaned back in his chair and stared at the ceiling, the fluorescent lights flickering slightly overhead. A performer, he muttered to himself. Someone who never stopped. The idea stuck to him like a burr. He imagined an aging man or woman, someone who had once toured with a traveling show, now drifting through the margins of the country, carrying fragments of that old life like relics. The costume, the knots, the makeup. Maybe they'd never accepted that the curtain had come down. Maybe they just kept performing in the dark. Later that afternoon, Harlan drove to the Montana State University Library, where the archives kept a dusty collection of regional entertainment records. The librarian, a quiet man with horn-rimmed glasses, led him to a back room filled with boxes labeled circus and traveling shows. 1999. He sifted through folders for hours, the smell of old paper thick in the air. Names blurred together: small-time carnivals, family-run acts, circuses that had flickered across the West before fading into bankruptcy. Then near the bottom of one box, he found a file stamped Midland Wonder Show dissolved 1992. Inside were promotional flyers, payroll lists, and inventory records. Most of the names were meaningless, long since forgotten, but one entry caught his eye: wardrobe inventory, forwarded forgery 25 frick, costumes, clown, ring, master, acrobat, manufactured by Laughing Giant Props Co. He frowned. He recognized the handwriting. The numbers matched the faded marking found on the inside seam of Ethan's costume, 402. It wasn't just a random piece of fabric. It had been catalogued, tracked, and owned. Back at his car, he called Dr. Mendoza. "That tag inside the costume," he said. "You're sure it wasn't just a factory mark?" She confirmed it wasn't. It was a property number, something used for stage inventory. Someone wanted to keep track of it. Harlan exhaled, staring through the windshield at the rain-slick parking lot. "Then whoever killed him didn't just find that costume," he said slowly. "They preserved it. They kept it for decades." The theory that had been forming in his head for days began to take shape. The killer had access to old performance gear, something so specific it had to come from a closed troupe or a collector. Harlan called in favors from colleagues in Nevada and Idaho, asking them to pull liquidation records from any circuses that folded in the early 90s. Within a week, a name came back from the archives in Reno. A company called the Laughing Giant Traveling Circus had gone bankrupt in 1993. All their assets, vehicles, props, costumes, were sold at auction. The buyer list was short, mostly collectors, costume rental shops, and a handful of private individuals. One name stood out: Arthur Finch, registered to a P.O. box in Carson City. He'd purchased Lot 45 vehicle and stage materials, which included a blue Chevrolet G-Series van and assorted performance costumes. Finch was listed as a technical assistant and lighting engineer, likely someone who had worked behind the scenes rather than in front of the crowd. His trail, however, ended abruptly. No recent address, no phone number, no tax records. It was as if he'd gone dark 30 years earlier. Harlan leaned back in his chair, staring at the name. It fit too well to be coincidence. A man once tied to a dying circus buys the exact kind of vehicle that left prints at Ethan's disappearance site. He keeps costumes from that era, including the one later used to dress the victim. It wasn't proof yet, but it was the outline of a monster taking shape. He began to see the pattern: not a crime of passion or opportunity, but an act of ritual preservation. The killer wasn't trying to hide his past. He was trying to recreate it. He contacted the Department of Motor Vehicles to trace the old van. The vehicle, a 1989 dark blue Chevrolet G-Series with custom modifications, had been registered under Finch's name until 2005. After that, it disappeared from state databases. No sale, no transfer, no record of destruction. If it's still out there, the clerk told him it's off the grid. That phrase stuck with Harlan all day. Off the grid. It described the killer perfectly, someone who had peeled away from society like old wallpaper and built his own small, private world somewhere in the emptiness. Back in his office, Harlan tacked a new photo to the evidence board, a faded black and white shot of Arthur Finch standing next to a tent, adjusting a spotlight. He looked ordinary, the kind of man you'd pass on the street without remembering. But the more Harlan studied him, the more unsettling that ordinariness became. There was nothing theatrical in his appearance, no wild expression or flamboyant pose, just calm focus, eyes fixed on the machinery behind the stage. The man who illuminated others while keeping himself in shadow. That night, unable to sleep, Harlan returned to the photos of Ethan's body. He focused on the way the knots wrapped around the wrists, the deliberate symmetry of the makeup, the faint, almost tender precision in how the body had been posed. Whoever did this had treated death like a rehearsal, not a crime. The mind, too, made more sense now. It wasn't just a hiding place, it was a set. The acoustics, the reflective walls, the isolation, it was as if Finch had found his own private theater underground. He pulled a pen from his pocket and wrote in the margin of his notice, "The killer doesn't bury, he stages." Then, under it, this was his show. The realization chilled him. If Finch had waited over 20 years to stage another performance, who was to say he would stop now? The murder wasn't random. It was selection, a new actor for a role he had written long ago. And that meant somewhere out there, the director was still waiting behind the curtain, preparing for his next act. The days following the identification of the costume were some of the longest of Detective Harlan's career. The air inside the precinct carried the stale tension of obsession papers, photographs, and hand-drawn maps cluttered his office until the floor itself looked like a crime scene of paper trails. Every new piece of evidence pointed backward in time, not forward. As if the key to Ethan Walker's death had been written decades earlier in the yellowed playbills of a forgotten circus. The costume's origin had opened a door, but what lay beyond was darker than Harlan could have guessed. The textile report confirmed what the forensic lab had hinted at. The yellow brocade fabric was a heavy industrial weave produced in limited batches during the mid-1980s. It was built to withstand heat, sweat, and repeated washing under harsh conditions typical of stage costumes meant for daily use beneath lighting rigs. When the analyst mentioned this, Harlan pictured tents filled with noise and sawdust, performers swaying under colored spotlights, and somewhere backstage, the dull clatter of a sewing machine stitching one last repair before showtime. Whoever made that suit hadn't expected it to survive 30 years, let alone become a shroud. The lab also discovered faint traces of oxidation beneath the collar, minute particles of iron dust consistent with environments rich in machinery. It was a strange clue, but one that fit the idea of someone living or working around old equipment, perhaps in a garage or a derelict industrial space. Harlan's mind returned again and again to that auction in 1993, when the Laughing Giant Circus sold off everything it owned. He imagined the scene: a rows of costumes draped over racks, cages stripped of animals, a line of trucks parked like ghosts waiting for buyers. The yellow clown suit had been just another item on a list, lot number 42. It would have sold for a few dollars, forgotten within minutes. But someone had seen it, recognized its worth not as cloth but as identity, and taken it home. That, Harlan realized, was when the story truly began, not with Ethan's disappearance, but with the man who bought a memory and refused to let it die. He called the state archives again, requesting the full auction ledger. When the records arrived, they came in the form of scanned microfilm pages, grainy but legible. The name Arthur Finch appeared beside several other purchases: lighting fixtures, rigging rope, and a performance transport vehicle. The description matched the old blue Chevrolet van. It was as if Finch had been building a portable stage, piece by piece, taking fragments of the Laughing Giant and reassembling them in secret. What unsettled Harlan most wasn't the logistics, it was the psychology. The man wasn't a collector. He was a curator of his own delusion, preserving the bones of a circus that the world had forgotten. He spent nights tracking down anyone still alive from the troupe. Many numbers were disconnected, addresses long abandoned. Finally, he found a retired animal trainer living in Nevada, a woman named Joan Meredith. She remembered Finch, vaguely quiet guy, always backstage, never talked much. When Harlan asked if he'd ever performed, she laughed softly. "Oh no, he wasn't one of us," said he didn't belong under the lights. He liked being the one who made others shine. The phrasing sent a chill through him. That same need for control had echoed through every detail of the murder, the way the body was dressed, painted, and positioned. Finch hadn't needed applause, he needed direction. As the investigation deepened, the team began reconstructing the timeline of Finch's life. Public records showed that after the circus collapsed, he drifted across several western states, working occasional jobs in maintenance and electrical repair. His last known address was a P.O. box in Reno, closed in 2005. After that he vanished, no taxes, no credit history, no social security filings. It was as though he'd stepped out of the grid and into a self-made oblivion. Harlan drew a long line across his evidence board, connecting the circus photo from 1987 to the mine in 2017. 30 years apart, yet bound by the same yellow thread. What disturbed him most was the growing sense of purpose behind every clue. The killer's world revolved around performance. Even death was a production. The knots, the makeup, the costume, all part of a script he'd written for himself. Ethan had been an actor cast without consent, his body turned into a prop, the mind transformed into a stage where the audience would never arrive. That thought haunted Harlan during the sleepless nights that followed. He began to wonder how many other performances might have taken place unseen. How many missing persons had been absorbed into the killer's private theater long before Ethan Walker ever existed. In late October, Harlan returned to the salt mine with a small forensic team, hoping that seeing the place again might shake something loose. They descended through the same shaft used during the recovery, their lights cutting through the thick air. The chamber where Ethan had been found felt smaller than he remembered, the walls slick with a fine sheen of moisture. The alcove itself was smooth, unnaturally so, like someone had taken the time to scrape away rough edges. On the floor, faint outlines of disturbed salt suggested that heavy objects had once been dragged across it. Perhaps props, perhaps something else. One of the techs found a nail embedded in the wall, small but deliberate, positioned at head height, maybe for lighting, he suggested. Harlan didn't answer. He already knew the nail had once held a lantern. The killer had wanted to see his work clearly. Back at the surface, Harlan stood at the mine's entrance, watching dust swirl through the fading sunlight. The world above felt too bright, too normal. He thought of Finch alone somewhere, surrounded by relics of applause that no longer existed. People like that didn't simply fade away, they rehearsed. They waited for the right scene, the right character, the right cue. A few days later, a courier delivered the cleaned and preserved costume to the evidence lab. Harlan went there in person. The technicians had laid it out on a long steel table, the yellow fabric stiff with age, its sequins dull but still catching the light like faint stars. Up close, it looked less like clothing and more like skin, something shed and left behind. Harlan ran his hand just above the surface, not touching it, feeling instead the cold aura it gave off. This was the killer's signature, his identity stitched into fabric. The detective's reflection wavered in the metal beneath it, and for a fleeting second he imagined what it must feel like to step into such a thing, to become someone else entirely. The thought chilled him enough to step back. That night he wrote his first complete profile of the suspect, male, late 50s to early 60s, itinerant lifestyle. Background in stage or technical performance, meticulous, ritualistic, likely narcissistic with delusional tendencies. But even as he typed the words, he knew they didn't capture the truth. The man wasn't killing out of rage or impulse, he was creating. And creation required patience, preparation, and vision. Harlan closed the report and stared out the window. The streetlights blurred against the glass, turning the world outside into a stage of muted color. Somewhere in that darkness, he knew the director of this twisted play was still out there, rehearsing his next act. The detective could almost hear him breathing in the quiet, waiting for the curtain to rise again. The old Nikon camera sat in the center of the evidence table like a relic from another century. It had been recovered alongside Ethan's remains, its metal frame coated in white salt dust, the lens cracked but intact. When the forensics team delivered it to Harlan's office, they handled it as though it were sacred. Cameras, unlike most evidence, carried a pulse, images trapped inside like memories that refused to die. Harlan stared at it for a long time before ordering the technicians to begin the restoration process. The salt had corroded the film housing, and the interior smelled faintly of metal and time, but there was a chance, however slim, that the film roll had survived. Forensic photographer Dana Ruiz took the lead on the delicate job. She worked behind sealed glass, wearing nitrile gloves and a breathing mask to protect the fragile film from moisture. "It's a 35mm roll," she said, peering into the disassembled camera body. "Looks brittle but not ruined. Salt actually preserved it better than humidity would have." She glanced at Harlan through the partition, her eyes flicking between curiosity and unease. "If this really is his last shoot, it might tell us everything." The film was extracted inch by inch, the emulsion layers so delicate they could disintegrate under the wrong light. Dana loaded it into a chemical bath under red illumination, her movements slow, ritualistic. For nearly an hour, no one spoke. Then she lifted the film strip gently into the drying cabinet, its translucent images shimmering faintly in the dim light. Harlan leaned closer, squinting through the glass. Even before development, you could make out outlines, dark shapes, fragments of buildings, the skeletal remains of Alder Creek's abandoned houses. Ethan's final photographs. When the first prints appeared later that evening, they covered a table in a neat row of ghostly landscapes. The images were hauntingly still, collapsed porches, doorways opening into nothing, windows reflecting only sky. There was artistry in them, the careful eye of someone who saw beauty in decay. But the further along they went, the more something changed. The framing grew tighter, as though Ethan had begun to sense movement around him. In one frame, a shadow cut across the dirt road, a shape that didn't belong to any structure. Another showed the faint reflection of a figure in a broken mirror, half hidden by glare. The figure's outline was large, broad-shouldered. Harlan felt a chill crawl up his neck. Dana stopped at frame 24, the second to last on the roll. The photo was blurred, but recognizable. Ethan's silver sedan parked on the dirt road, its driver's door open. Behind it, partially obscured by sunlight, a dark vehicle loomed in the background. It was tall, rectangular, a van, maybe. The color was impossible to determine, but the silhouette matched something Harlan had seen before. He reached into his case file and pulled out a photograph of a 1989 Chevrolet Series van. The resemblance was uncanny. "That's him," Harlan whispered. "Finch." The final frame froze everyone in the room. It was underexposed, almost black, but when enhanced digitally, faint details emerged: a gloved hand gripping a camera lens, the edge of a sleeve, and behind it, a blurred emblem, something circular painted on metal. Dana adjusted the filters, revealing the faint ghost of lettering. The first word was nearly gone, but the second was clear enough to read giant. Harlan exhaled sharply. The laughing giant, the circus logo, faded but unmistakable, painted on the side of the killer's van. That single image changed the trajectory of the investigation. For months, Harlan had been working from theories and circumstantial evidence. Now he had visual proof linking Ethan's abduction to Finch's vehicle. The photo, though grainy, was enough to reopen every dormant lead. It also confirmed something more chilling. Ethan had seen his killer. He'd photographed the van moments before being taken. The image was both a clue and a message, a frozen instant of recognition caught in the lens of a dying man. The next morning, the discovery made headlines. "Murderer's van caught on victim's camera," one article read, accompanied by the blown-up image. News crews camped outside the precinct, their vans lined along the curb like vultures waiting for fresh scraps. Harlan hated it. This wasn't triumph. It was exposure. The killer, wherever he was, would know they were closed now. For the next several days, the department received a flood of tips. People called in from all over the state claiming they'd seen a similar van parked behind warehouses, idling near truck stops, abandoned along rural highways. Most leads fizzled within hours, but one stood out. A trucker passing through the small town of Redmond reported an old blue van parked behind a shuttered theater on the outskirts of town. The description matched perfectly: aged paint, high roof, blacked-out rear windows, and on the driver's door, the faded outline of a laughing face surrounded by lettering. Harlan drove there himself. The theater, once called the Starview Playhouse, had been closed for 20 years. Its marquee still clung to rusted beams, letters missing, pigeons nesting in the rafters. The parking lot was cracked with weeds, littered with broken glass, and there, near the loading dock, sat the van. It looked like it hadn't moved in years, dust layering the windshield, tires half deflated. But as he approached, he noticed something that didn't fit. The hood was warm. He signaled for backup before stepping closer. The vehicle's side panel bore a faint image, the outline of a grinning cartoon giant holding a balloon, its colors nearly erased by time. The word laughing was gone, but giant was still visible beneath the grime. Harlan's pulse hammered in his ears. He tried the handle. It was unlocked. Inside, the smell hit first a mix of rust, oil, and something far more unpleasant, a sweet rot that clung to the upholstery. The interior had been stripped down, fitted with wooden panels and hooks along the walls. A workbench lined one side, cluttered with brushes, pigments, and tins of grease paint. Photographs covered the opposite wall, black and white portraits of clowns, acrobats, ringmasters, faces from another era, some smiling, some grim. In the center of the dashboard, taped neatly to the cracked vinyl, was a small Polaroid of Ethan Walker smiling into the camera. Harlan felt the ground tilt beneath him. The killer hadn't just taken trophies, he'd created a shrine. Everything inside that van was part of a private museum, a tribute to performance and decay. The brushes were still damp, the makeup tins freshly opened. Finch, or whoever he was now, had been here recently, maybe only hours ago. When the forensics team arrived, they processed the scene meticulously. They lifted fingerprints, collected fabric fibers, cataloged every object. But the man himself was gone. In the glove compartment, they found a single notebook wrapped in plastic. The first page bore only one line, written in neat, deliberate handwriting: "Every act deserves an audience." That night, as Harlan drove back through the rain, the weight of the discovery pressed against his chest. The van had confirmed what he already suspected: the killer wasn't improvising, he was rehearsing. Every photograph, every costume, every knot was part of a continuing show. The discovery of Ethan's film hadn't ended the case. It had only turned the page. Somewhere out there, under another sky, the curtain was rising again. Rain sheeted down across the windshield as Detective Harlan guided the car through the empty streets of Redmond. The storm had rolled in without warning, soaking the town in a cold, relentless drizzle that blurred the lights into a smear of gold and gray. The van, the blue Chevrolet with the faded giant logo, had been towed to a secure facility outside Helena, but the image of it still haunted him. Even with its engine dead and its doors sealed for evidence, it felt alive somehow, like a sleeping beast that might stir if you stood too close. The photographs taped to the inside walls, the brushes and paint tins, the Polaroid of Ethan, all of it spoke of ritual. Finch hadn't been living in that van, he had been working in it, like an artist in his studio. At dawn, Harlan sat in the evidence garage, staring at the vehicle under fluorescent lights. Every inch of its surface told a story of time: faded paint, rust creeping like veins, stickers peeling from the bumper. The forensic techs moved quietly around him, photographing details and logging every object removed. "We found tire mud samples," one of them said. "Same mineral composition as Gallatin Canyon. Matches the site where Ethan's car was abandoned." Harlan nodded. The van wasn't just a piece of the puzzle, it was the missing link between the disappearance and the mine. They opened the back doors carefully. Inside, beneath a tarp, was a wooden crate filled with rolled fabrics. When unwrapped, they revealed more costumes: a ringmaster's coat, a faded harlequin jumpsuit, and a sequined jacket with moth-eaten edges. Each piece bore an inventory number stitched along the inner seam, identical to the one found on Ethan's clown suit. Lot numbers, all from the same collection, the Laughing Giant. Harlan ran his gloved hand over the fabric, feeling the weight of history pressing through the threads. These weren't props anymore. They were the killer's language. Tucked beneath the fabrics was a collection of film reels, neatly labeled with years instead of titles: 1989, 1994, 2002, 16. He had them sent to the lab for restoration. The film stock was old but well preserved, sealed in airtight canisters. The idea of watching whatever Finch had recorded made Harlan uneasy. There was intent in that organization, a storyteller's precision. The man hadn't just been keeping memories, he had been building a narrative. Later that afternoon, Harlan sat in the viewing room with two technicians. The first reel flickered to life on the screen, black and white footage jittering under the projector's hum. It opened with an old circus tent, striped canvas flapping in the wind, performers drifting in and out of frame. A clown stood near the center, waving at the camera. Even through the grain, the costume was unmistakable, the same yellow brocade with the diamond pattern. Finch was there too, younger, thinner, standing behind the camera equipment, adjusting lights. He barely looked up, but when he did, the lens caught his face. The resemblance to the man in the archival photo was undeniable. The footage shifted. The next segment was darker, filmed indoors. It showed a small stage lit by harsh spotlights. The performers looked uneasy, their movements jerky, their smiles forced. At one point, a performer stumbled, and the camera zoomed in too close, too long. It wasn't art, it was obsession. Finch lingered on imperfection, cataloging it like a critic dissecting flaws. Then, abruptly, the film cut to black. The next reel began in color. The year was labeled 1994. The circus was gone. Instead, the footage showed empty fields, shuttered buildings, and long stretches of highway. A lone man, Finch, stood before the camera, dressed not as a performer, but as a director, holding a clapperboard with the words Act 1 scrawled across it. He didn't speak, but his posture radiated purpose. The reel ended with a shot of a mannequin seated in a chair, painted in clown makeup, lit by a single lamp. The expression was grotesquely human. By the time they reached the reel marked 2016, the room felt like a tomb. This one was filmed digitally, its clarity almost worse than the grainy nostalgia of the older reels. It began with footage of the mine entrance. Finch's voice, calm and measured, narrated over the wind. Every story ends where silence begins. Down here, the light never dies, it just waits. The camera tilted toward the ground, showing tools, brushes, and the edge of the yellow costume. Then came a shot of an empty salt chamber, smooth and cold, waiting like a stage before curtain call. The reel ended abruptly. No sign of Ethan, but Harlan didn't need to see him. The meaning was already clear. Finch had been preparing that chamber long before the murder. It wasn't spontaneous, it was a set he'd been constructing for years, refining it for the perfect subject. Ethan hadn't just been in the wrong place. He'd walked straight into a production that had already been written. Harlan's stomach turned as the lights came up. He documented everything, one technician said softly. He wanted to be remembered. Harlan didn't reply. His mind replayed the line from Finch's notebook, "Every act deserves an audience." Now it made perfect sense. Finch wasn't killing to destroy, he was killing to preserve, to immortalize. Each death was a scene, each victim an unwilling performer. They pulled Finch's financial records next, or what little existed. There were no active accounts, but one name surfaced repeatedly on shipping receipts and small cash purchases, a Nash. The alias led them to a storage unit rented under that name in a rural town south of Redmond. The unit hadn't been accessed in months, but the rent had been prepaid for years in advance. Harlan took a small team there the next day. The facility sat off a lonely highway, surrounded by bare fields and skeletal trees. The clerk handed over the key reluctantly, muttering that the tenant was odd but polite. The moment they opened the door, the smell hit them, salt oil and something metallic. Inside, mannequins lined the walls, dressed in decaying costumes. Some were clowns, others acrobats, all arranged as if mid-performance. On the floor lay coils of rope, lighting rigs, and an old wooden director's chair with the initials, a F, carved into the back. Pinned along the far wall was a storyboard, rows of yellowing papers connected by string, each one labeled Act followed by a number. The last page was blank, except for a handwritten noted Act 5 to be continued. Harlan stared at it, his pulse hammering. If this was Finch's private theater, Ethan's death had been only one part of a larger production. There were other acts, maybe other victims. The thought made the air feel heavier, the silence unbearable. They collected everything: costumes, film reels, props, and the director's chair. When they left, the wind blew through the open doorway, scattering salt dust across the floor like falling ash. Harlan looked back once, imagining Finch sitting in that chair, watching his mannequins perform their silent play. It wasn't madness anymore, it was legacy. Back at the precinct, he laid the new evidence across his desk. The reels, the props, the storyboards, they were all pieces of the same mind. Finch wasn't improvising murders, he was writing them. Each scene rehearsed, each act perfected. And the terrifying question that kept echoing through Harlan's head wasn't why Finch did it, but when the next act would begin. Detective Harlan hadn't slept properly in weeks. His desk had become a graveyard of coffee cups and open-case files, the walls of his office a college of photographs, maps, and notes that resembled more a conspiracy than an investigation. Every thread led back to the same man, the same shadow that had been hiding behind the face of the circus for 30 years. Arthur Finch was no longer a myth or an alias on paper. He had a history, a pattern, and now, finally, a location. The evidence from the storage unit had been more than just theater props, it was a blueprint. Finch had planned everything down to the smallest detail, and yet something in his precision gave him away. One of the film canisters found in the van contained partial coordinates etched into its metal lid, barely visible under years of grime. The numbers didn't make sense at first, they weren't complete latitude and longitude, but when overlaid with a local grid map, they matched a small cluster of abandoned cabins near the Bitterroot Mountains. The area was remote, uninhabited for decades, and mostly forgotten except by hunters who avoided it after dark. Old mining cabins, some partially collapsed, stood there like skeletal remains of a forgotten town. It was the kind of place Finch would choose, secluded, familiar, and perfectly suited for someone who saw life as an endless performance. Harlan assembled a small tactical team and set out before dawn, headlights slicing through fog and drizzle. He didn't tell the walkers, not yet. He couldn't bear to promise anything again until he knew for certain. As they approached the foothills, the forest thickened, swallowing the road until it turned to gravel and then to mud. The GPS signal died. They parked a mile away and continued on foot, flashlights cutting narrow tunnels of light through the mist. The silence was profound, no birds, no wind, only the faint creak of branches shifting under their own weight. The cabins appeared suddenly through the fog, hunched and crooked, their roofs sagging under years of neglect. But one stood apart. It had a new padlock on the door, fresh tire tracks leading up to it, and faint light leaking from a boarded window. Harlan signaled the team to fan out. They moved quietly, boots sinking into wet earth. Through the broken slats of a window, he saw movement, a figure pacing slowly, methodically. The outline was unmistakable, tall, lean, shoulders stooped slightly forward. On the table beside him, an oil lamp flickered, illuminating walls covered with photographs and drawings. Costumes hung from hooks. A mirror stood in the corner, cracked but still reflective, its surface smeared with white grease paint fingerprints. Finch was here. They breached the door in silence, a quick burst of splintered wood and shouts echoing through the cabin. Finch turned toward them but didn't run. He stood perfectly still, head tilted, watching as if assessing the scene. His face was lined, his hair thin and gray, but his eyes were clear and unsettlingly calm. "Careful," he said quietly, voice raspy from disuse. "You re-stepping on my stage." One of the officers shouted for him to get down. Finch smiled faintly, the expression almost tender. "At least let me bow first." They restrained him without resistance. The cabin's interior was worse than the photos from the mine, dozens of photographs pinned across the walls, each depicting people in various costumes, clowns, jugglers, dancers. Some were black and white, some color, and a few recent enough that the paper hadn't yet faded. Under each image, handwritten titles appeared: Act 1, The Fire Eater; Act 2, The Contortionist; Act 3, The Vanishing Boy. Ethan's name wasn't written anywhere, but his image was there, captured in eerie stillness, smiling faintly. Had tilted it in that same way they'd found him in the mine. The team cataloged everything. Finch sat silently as they worked, hands cuffed, watching with mild curiosity. When Harlan finally faced him, the old man seemed almost relieved. "You took long enough," Finch murmured. "Most audiences never make it to the final act." Harlan didn't respond. He was too busy staring at the table in front of him. A map was spread across it, covered in pencil marking circles drawn around remote locations across the state. Next to each circle were notes: stage ready, lighting complete, needs audience. It wasn't just one performance. Finch had planned a series, an ongoing production that had stretched across decades. Back at headquarters, the interrogation room felt colder than usual. Finch sat across from Harlan, posture impeccable, his cuffed hands resting neatly on the table. There was no defiance in his demeanor, no bravado, only an unsettling composure. "You understand why you re-here?" Harlan asked. Finch nodded slowly. "Of course. You re-here to close the curtain. But that's not your job, detective. Curtains are for the audience." For hours, Harlan questioned him about Ethan Walker. Finch answered in riddles at first, describing scenes instead of events, speaking as if narrating a play. "He was curious," Finch said softly. "He wandered into the wrong theater. I didn't choose him, he chose me. You see, art isn't about the performer. It's about the moment." "He became the moment." Harlan clenched his jaw. "You killed him." Finch tilted his head. "No, I preserved him. He's still there, isn't he? Untouched, eternal. The soul keeps him perfect, no rot, no decay. That's art, detective. The world forgets, but I don't." There was no remorse in his tone, no hint of insanity either, just conviction. The more he spoke, the more Harlan realized that Finch didn't see himself as a murderer at all. In his mind, he had saved his victims from the inevitable decay of time, transforming them into pieces of his eternal show. Each act had been a resurrection of his lost world, the circus, the applause, the spotlight. "The world turned its back on us," Finch said, eyes distant. "They left our tents to rot, but I kept it alive. I gave them their encore." When the forensic results came back, they confirmed what Harlan had already guessed. From multiple unidentified individuals was found on costumes and props inside the cabin. Finch's timeline stretched far beyond Ethan. At least 3 other victims were tied to him, 2 from the mid-1990s, 1 from 2002. Their disappearances had been written off as runaways or accidents. Now, the truth was plain: they had all been part of Finch's performances. During his final confession, Finch leaned forward, his voice low and measured. "You know what I loved most about the circus detective? Timing. It's everything. The audience doesn't remember the tricks. They remember when you reveal them." He smiled faintly. "You arrived right on cue." The trial that followed was brief but brutal. The evidence was overwhelming: photographs, costumes, the films, and Finch's own words. He sat in court without expression, eyes fixed on something no one else could see. The press dubbed him the director, a title he seemed to accept with quiet pride. When the verdict came, life imprisonment without parole, he bowed his head slightly, as though taking his final curtain call. Afterward, Harlan drove out to the Walkers' home. The autumn air was crisp, the leaves beginning to turn. He told them everything, at least the parts he could bear to say aloud. Marlene cried silently. David listened without blinking, his eyes focused on the horizon as though expecting to see his son walking up the road. When Harlan left, he lingered by his car, staring at the setting sun bleeding through the trees. Justice felt hollow. That night, as the sky deepened to black, Harlan pulled the old case file from his shelf one last time. Inside were all the artifacts that had led him here: the photographs, the costume tags, the faded flyer for the Laughing Giant Circus. He studied the smiling faces of the performers, each one frozen in time. Then his gaze drifted to the last page, where Finch's mugshot had been clipped. Even behind bars, the man had managed a small, deliberate smile. Harlan closed the folder and turned off the light. But as he walked away, the words Finch had spoken still echoed in his head, carried on the quiet hum of memory: "Every act deserves an audience." And for the first time, the detective wondered if the show had truly ended, or if, somewhere in the dark, another curtain was already rising. The winter after Arthur Finch's conviction settled over Montana like a heavy blanket of silence. Snow muted everything: the sound of tires, the wind across the canyons, even the restless hum of the town that had spent a year watching the investigation unfold. For most people, the trial had been closure. They spoke of it as if the story had ended neatly, the villain caught, the balance restored. But for Detective Sam Harlan, the ending never came. It lingered in the corners of his mind like a scene left unfinished, a line of dialogue that didn't quite make sense. Finch was in prison, yes, but there was something in the man's calm acceptance, his measured tone, his final words that felt less like defeat and more like anticipation. Harlan still worked his usual caseload: petty thefts, missing livestock, a domestic dispute that turned ugly on a reservation road. He went through the motions with the same tired precision, but part of him remained in that cabin in the Bitterroots, surrounded by walls of faded photographs and costumes that smelled of salt and decay. Some nights he'd dream of them: the mannequins, the cracked mirrors, the cloying grease paint that seemed to stick to his skin no matter how many times he washed his hands. In his dreams, the mannequins would breathe. Their eyes followed him. They whispered lines from a script he could never quite remember upon waking. He told himself it was just exhaustion, the mind's way of processing too much horror. But the feeling didn't fade. It deepened. Then one morning in early February, he received a letter addressed to him at the station. No return address, the envelope thick and stiff with moisture damage. Inside was a single sheet of paper, handwritten in careful script. Every production needs continuity. The show cannot end where the curtain falls, it must be carried forward. Thank you for keeping the audience waiting. There was no signature, but beneath the message was a small drawing, a stage light suspended above a stick figure bowing. Harlan felt the blood drain from his face. He read the letter twice before locking it in his desk. He told no one. It could have been a cruel joke, a leftover fan letter from the trial, but something about the tone, the deliberate calm, felt too familiar. Finch was behind bars under constant surveillance. He couldn't have written it, unless, of course, someone else had. 2 weeks later, the warden of the state penitentiary called. Finch had been found dead in his cell at dawn. No sign of struggle, no obvious cause beyond heart failure, though the man had shown no symptoms of illness. Harlan drove to the prison, needing to see for himself. The cell was immaculate. Finch's belongings, few as they were, had been neatly stacked on his cot. A notebook lay open on the small metal desk, filled with sketches of stages, tents, and faces. Each drawing was labeled the audience. The last page bore only a single line in block letters: Act 5 begins. The coroner ruled it natural death. Harlan didn't believe it. Finch had always spoken as though death was just another part of his performance, another cue. He'd even said, "The curtain doesn't close for me, detective, it just rises somewhere else." Now, standing in that cold, fluorescent, lit cell, Harlan realized the old man had meant it literally. A month passed. Snow melted, revealing the dull bones of winter grass. Then the calls began, first from reporters, then from other departments. A missing persons case out of Idaho. A young woman, 23, last seen leaving a photography workshop in Coeur d'Alene. Her car was found abandoned near a highway turnout, engine still running, door ajar. The similarities were too precise to ignore. But when the search party located her a week later, the truth was worse than déjà vu. Her body had been found in an abandoned limestone quarry, seated upright, dressed in a performer's costume, an acrobat this time, sequined blue with a silver mask covering her face. The pose was deliberate, the execution flawless. It was as if Finch's ghost had returned. Harlan stood at the quarry's edge, wind cutting sharp across the stone, and stared down at the crime scene below. The same attention to detail, the same reverence. Even the makeup was applied with care. "You think someone's copying him?" one of the younger deputies asked. Harlan didn't answer. His eyes drifted to a small object resting on a nearby rock, a brass compass, its glass cracked. He picked it up, brushing away dust. On the back, engraved in the same looping script as Finch's old notes, were 3 words for the next act. That night, he opened the old case file again. Finch's photographs, the reels, the letters, all of it was there, laid out like the storyboard to a film that refused to end. The thought gnawed at him. Finch had never been working alone. The storage unit inventory listed more props than could have fit in one man's van. Several items had been missing when the evidence was catalogued. Someone else had been helping him. Perhaps an apprentice, perhaps a believer. The FBI reopened the investigation, branding it a potential copycat case. But Harlan knew better. The details were too intimate, too exact. Whoever did this had learned directly from Finch. He began cross-referencing old circus rosters again, searching for names that might have vanished alongside him when the troupe dissolved. He found one that made him stop: Edwin Eddie Harrow, assistant rigger, 20 years, Finch's junior. Last known address, Redmond, Montana. No death certificate, no social security activity since 1993. The name had appeared once before, buried deep in Finch's old notes, a margin scribble next to a rough sketch of a 2-man act. Lighting by Eddie, timing perfect. Harlan's pulse quickened as he pulled up what little record remained. Harrow had been a quiet figure, known for building rigging systems and managing props. A background that fit perfectly with the knotwork and stage-like precision of the crimes. He had vanished around the same time the Laughing Giant folded. Finch hadn't gone into hiding alone. He'd gone underground with an accomplice. When Harlan drove out to Redmond again, the same mist clung to the highway as it had the morning they found Finch's van. The air smelled of thawing earth and rust. He stopped at the old Starview Playhouse, now fully collapsed under years of neglect. Snowmelt dripped through the roof in steady rhythm. Near the back wall something glinted. He brushed away the dirt to reveal another Polaroid. It showed Finch standing beside a younger man, Eddie Harrow, unmistakably. Both wore paint-smeared work clothes, smiling faintly at the camera. Behind them, scrawled across the wall in faded chalk, were the words, "The show must go on." That night, as the wind howled outside his motel, Harlan couldn't sleep. Finch had never needed to escape prison. He'd already passed the torch. Somewhere out there, Harrow was continuing the performance, perfecting the next act, ensuring that the curtain would never truly fall. When the phone rang at 3 a.m., he already knew what it would be. Another body had been found, this time in Oregon, in a derelict warehouse filled with circus posters and salt residue. The victim was posed in front of a painted backdrop depicting a stage. Beneath it, written in perfect handwriting, were the words Finch had promised in his cell: Act 5 begins. Harlan sat at the edge of the bed, the receiver pressed against his ear, and stared into the dark. He finally understood what Finch had meant all along. Death wasn't an ending for men like him, it was direction. And somewhere, in the echo of every crime scene, the show was still playing, waiting for its next audience to arrive. The warehouse on the Oregon coast smelled of salt and smoke and old wood. By the time Detective Harlan arrived, the air inside was thick with the residue of something that had burned days ago: lantern oil, paint, and the faint sweetness of decay. It was nearly dawn, and pale light seeped through holes in the roof, illuminating dust in slow motion. The scene below was almost beautiful in its horror. A small stage had been built from scrap planks, framed by torn velvet curtains that looked they'd once belonged to a real theater. And at the center of it all, seated upright beneath a single spotlight, was the latest victim. She was posed with grace, one arm draped outward, head tilted toward the audience of empty chairs arranged before her. Her makeup was subtle, unlike Finch's gaudy designs. The colors were cooler, muted modern. Whoever had done this had evolved the art. Harlan stood in silence for a long time before moving closer. The others, crime scene techs, federal agents, photographers, kept their distance. They had learned by now that he needed to take it in alone first, to feel the scene rather than just observe it. The stage was elevated by about a foot, enough to force the viewer to look up slightly, giving the illusion of reverence. Behind the victim hung a painted backdrop depicting a vast circus tent opening into a star-filled night. On the lower right corner, the artist had signed a single word in black ink: Harrow. He felt a chill crawl through him. Eddie Harrow, the missing assistant, the apprentice Finch had trained all those years ago. There was no more doubt. The torch had passed, and the new director was continuing the show. But this wasn't imitation, it was reinvention. The technique was cleaner, the aesthetic sharper. Finch's work had been nostalgia wrapped in madness. Harrow's was something else, something that understood modern spectacle, the digital gaze of a new audience. On the far wall, mounted beside a stack of broken props, was a camera, not film, digital, live stream capable. Whoever did this hadn't just staged a scene, he had recorded it. Forensics recovered the memory card. Back at the command post, they projected the footage. The video opened with static, then the sound of heavy breathing. The camera steadied, focusing on the empty stage. For nearly a minute, nothing moved. Then a man stepped into frame. He wore dark clothing and gloves, his face concealed by a half-mask painted in white and silver. He adjusted the camera, then turned toward the stage where the woman sat motionless. His voice, when he spoke, was calm and deliberate. "Tonight," he said, "we open a new season. The audience grows, even if they pretend not to watch." He approached the woman, brushing her hair aside with almost tender care, and looked back into the lens. They thought the show could end with him. But art doesn't die, it just changes its medium. He stepped closer to the camera, filling the frame. His eyes were visible above the mask, blue, cold, intelligent. "Detective Harlan," he said softly, as if addressing the viewer directly, "I hope you're still watching." Then the feed cut to black. The room went still. No one spoke for several seconds. Harlan felt the weight of every heartbeat echo in his ears. It wasn't just taunting, it was choreography. Harrow had known the footage would find him. This was an invitation. And for the first time, Harlan realized what the killer meant by audience. He wasn't talking about the public, the police, or the media. He was talking about Harlan himself. The FEPA wanted to centralize the investigation, arguing that Harrow's reach had expanded beyond state lines. Harlan didn't argue, but he stayed on the case as a consultant. He knew the man better than anyone, even Finch. In a way, he had been studying him before the crimes began, studying the psychology of control, of spectacle. And now Harrow was responding, as if they were locked in a dialogue conducted through death and design. Each new scene would be a message, another layer of performance meant for Harlan alone. He spent days going through the footage frame by frame. In one corner of the video, behind the painted backdrop, there was movement, a flicker of light too deliberate to be random. When enhanced, it revealed a reflection, a window looking out over the sea. Harlan pulled old maps of the coast, cross-referencing shuttered buildings with similar architecture. After 2 nights of no sleep, he found a match. A former maritime museum near Cannon Beach, closed since 2008. Local police confirmed recent signs of trespassing. They surrounded the building at dawn. The ocean crashed against the cliffs below, mist rising from the surf like smoke. Harlan led the entry team through a side door, his flashlight cutting across display cases filled with ship models and corroded compasses. The silence was thick, broken only by the distant rhythm of waves. Then, from somewhere deeper in the building, came the faint hum of a projector. They followed the sound into the central exhibit hall. A large screen stood at the far end, illuminated by flickering film. The reel showed old footage from Finch's collection, grainy shots of the laughing giant circus, tents swaying in the wind, children laughing in slow motion. On the floor before the screen sat a chair. In it, a mannequin dressed in one of Finch's original costumes, its porcelain head turned toward the projection as if watching a memory unfold. A small speaker beside it played a familiar voice, Finch's voice, recorded decades earlier. "Every show needs a closing act," it said. "And every director needs someone to carry the light when he's gone." On the wall above the screen, written in dripping black paint, were 3 words: "You relate, detective." The sound of a door slamming echoed somewhere above them. The team fanned out. Harlan climbed the metal staircase 2 steps at a time, flashlight bouncing off the walls. The upper hallway was narrow, lined with storage rooms. At the end of it, a single bulb flickered. He approached cautiously, weapon drawn. Inside, the air smelled of salt and burnt wiring. A workbench stood against the wall, covered with open notebooks, costume sketches, and small vials of dried pigments. In the center sat a framed photograph of Finch and Harrow together, both in clown makeup, both smiling at the camera. Pinned beside it was another note, written in the same looping script as before: "A final rehearsal complete. Curtain call soon." Beneath the note, taped to the table, was a small drive. Harlan pocketed it before the techs arrived. Later, when he watched it back at headquarters, the video contained only a single clip: Harrow standing on a cliff, the sea raging behind him. He looked directly into the lens. "The world doesn't clap anymore, detective," he said. "So I'll make them watch." He smiled faintly. "Act 6 is yours." And then, with a deliberate motion, he stepped backward into the mist. The camera tumbled, capturing nothing but waves and gray sky. They searched for him for weeks. Helicopters swept the coastline, divers combed the rocks. No body was ever found. Some said he'd drowned. Others said he'd escaped by sea, vanishing like his mentor before him. Harlan didn't believe either. Harrow was too deliberate, too disciplined. If he wanted to disappear, he would have planned it down to the breath. Months later, after the case was officially suspended, Harlan returned to his apartment overlooking the valley. The nights were quiet again, but not peaceful. Sometimes, when the wind shifted, he could swear he heard faint music drifting from the darkness, a carnival tune, slow and warped, like an old record turning at the wrong speed. He told himself it was nothing. But in the deepest hours, when sleep refused to come, he would look at the box of evidence on his shelf, the reels, the photographs, the yellow costume sealed in plastic, and wonder if, somewhere in the dark corners of America, the curtain was already rising again. Because men like Finch and Harrow didn't vanish, they just changed the stage, and every story, no matter how dark, always waits for its next audience. The story of Ethan Walker, Arthur Finch, and Eddie Harrow is not just a tale of crime and madness, it's a parable about obsession, creation, and the dark places the human mind will go when it confuses immortality with meaning. On the surface, it's a story of murder, of cruelty turned into theater. But beneath that horror lies a truth about art, about the way people will twist beauty into violence just to be remembered. Finch wasn't simply a killer. He was an artist who could not accept the end of his audience. When the circus died, he lost the only thing that had ever given him purpose, the gaze of others. So he built his own world where applause would never fade, where every act could be preserved in salt and silence. What makes his evil so unsettling is that it didn't come from rage or greed. It came from devotion. The devotion of a man who loved his craft so much that he destroyed others to keep it alive. There's a terrible irony at the heart of the story. Both Finch and Harrow believed they were rescuing beauty from decay. They didn't see their victims as people, they saw them as symbols, as frozen moments that could outlive death. They convinced themselves that by staging their murders, they were preserving life in its purest form, uncorrupted by time. But what they really created was the opposite: a stillness without soul, perfection without heartbeat. It's a lesson about the danger of mistaking control for creation. When art loses empathy, when it stops feeling and starts dictating, it becomes a mirror for ego, not truth. Finch's performances were his way of defying obscurity, of refusing to vanish like the circus that birthed him. And in his defiance, he turned art into ritual and ritual into murder. Detective Harlan's journey, on the other hand, reflects the cost of bearing witness to that kind of darkness. He began as a man of reason, a believer in order and justice, but the case hollowed him. The more he understood Finch, the more he realized how thin the line was between obsession and duty. Finch built a stage for his own myth. Harlan built a wall of evidence around his. Both sought to bring clarity to chaos, one through performance, the other through pursuit. And in doing so, both became trapped in the same endless act. Harlan's obsession with understanding the killer mirrored Finch's obsession with preserving the performance. Neither could let go. The killer needed an audience, and the detective needed an ending. But in the world they inhabited, there were no endings, only transitions from one act to the next. The story also speaks to how legacy can corrupt purpose. Finch's crimes didn't die with him. They evolved, adapted, and found new expression in Eddie Harrow. Evil, when dressed in ideology or artistry, becomes seductive. Harrow wasn't coerced into continuing Finch's work, he chose to. He saw the same promise his mentor had seen: immortality through spectacle. Every generation inherits something from the last art, ideology, or madness, and decides whether to continue it or break the cycle. Harrow's choice shows how easily admiration can turn into worship, and how worship can become justification for cruelty. His murders were not just copycat crimes, they were tributes, a way of saying, the show isn't over. And in that declaration, he revealed a truth that applies far beyond his character. As long as there are those who romanticize darkness, it will always find a way to return. The tragedy of Ethan Walker lies in how he stumbled into this world by doing something pure, seeking beauty. He wanted to capture the silence of forgotten places, to preserve stories left behind by time. In many ways, he was the mirror opposite of Finch. Ethan used his camera to document decay, to find meaning in endings, not to fight them. But that pursuit of stillness led him straight into the path of a man who mistook stillness for eternity. Ethan's death is the most brutal metaphor of all, that innocence can't survive in the presence of obsession. It reminds us that some ruins should remain undisturbed, that curiosity has limits when it begins trespassing on the broken dreams of others. In a broader sense, the story is about what happens when human beings try to control time. Finch tried to stop it. Harrow tried to continue it. Harlan tried to understand it. But time doesn't bend to will, it consumes all things. The mine, the van, the warehouse, all those spaces of creation became tomes because they tried to resist decay. The salt that preserved Ethan's body was the same salt that symbolized the futility of preservation itself. It's a cruel symmetry. What saves the body destroys the soul. The story's landscapes, canyons, mines, theaters, the sea aren't just settings. They're metaphors for the endless struggle against impermanence. Perhaps the hardest lesson in the story is that evil doesn't always look monstrous. Sometimes it wears the face of passion, of precision, of purpose. Finch wasn't chaos, he was order without compassion. His crimes were rehearsed, balanced, beautiful in composition, and that's what makes them terrifying. The story warns us not to confuse discipline with morality. A man can be meticulous in his cruelty and see himself as righteous. A killer can believe he's an artist, and when that belief finds a student, as it did in Harrow, the performance never ends. For Harlan, the final lesson is the most haunting, that bearing witness to darkness changes you. You start by chasing truth, and you end by inheriting the silence it leaves behind. By the time Harrow vanished, Harlan understood what Finch had meant when he said every act needs an audience. It wasn't about vanity, it was about inevitability. To see horror is to become part of it, even if only as the one who remembers. By hunting the story, Harlan became its custodian, its unwilling narrator. The case may have ended on paper, but in memory it goes on another act in the same endless performance. And so, the true lesson of the story isn't about murder or madness, it's about the human need to leave something behind. We all want to be remembered, to be seen, to have our lives mean something beyond their end. Finch wanted applause, Harrow wanted continuation, Harlan wanted justice, and each, in their own way, failed to escape the same truth: everything fades. What defines us is how we face that fading. Some try to preserve the moment, others try to expose it, but the only real grace lies in letting it go. If the story teaches anything, it's that art without empathy becomes cruelty, purpose without limits becomes obsession, and memory without peace becomes a curse. The curtain always falls, no matter how many times you raise it again. The audience moves on, the lights go dark. And maybe, in that darkness, the only act worth remembering is the one where we finally stop performing and learn to be human again. The darkness doesn't end here. Subscribe, turn on notifications, and let me take you deeper into things not everyone dares to face.